Good evening, everyone. Përshëndetje të gjithëve. My name is Krenare Recaj, and as co-chair, it is my great honor to welcome you all to the Gala, the opening gala of Memory, Politics, and Precedents, Canada-Kosovo and the Kosovar refugee diaspora 25 years on.
And my name is Laura Madokoro, and along with Arta Tahiraj, we will be your hosts for this evening.
We are delighted to begin the program this evening with recorded comments from the Right Honorable Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
Hello, bonjour à tous. 25 years ago, countless Kosovar Albanians were forced to flee their homes in search of protection. Yet they showed remarkable resilience, waiting for the world to answer their call for help. And as we've done countless times before, Canada stepped up. In April 1999, the brave women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces launched Operation Parasol. Une opération qui, avec le soutien des forces policières, d'agents d'immigration et de diplomates et de bénévoles de partout au pays, a aidé nos amis kosovars à refaire leur vie ici. The story of Operation Parasol embodies what makes us so proud to be Canadians. A story of Canadians choosing to do everything in their power to help those in need. A story of refugees finding not just safety, but a home. But of course, the story doesn't end there. Forged out of the refugee crisis, Canada's relationship with Kosovo has become one of partnership, one of friendship. So as we mark 25 years since the arrival of the first Kosovar Albanians, let's celebrate their contributions to Canada, and let us always stand for the rights and self-determination of the Kosovar people. Thank you. Merci beaucoup, mes chers amis.
Next, please join us in welcoming to the stage Her Excellency Danica Gavrilă-Schwarz, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Diaspora of the Republic of Kosovo.
Good evening, dear friends. Mirëmbrëma të gjithë ju që keni ardhur sonte. Ladies and gentlemen, let me first start by greeting our special guests, all those who today and 25 years ago were there when people in Kosovo, people fleeing from Kosovo have needed them the most. So let me start by greeting the Honorable Dr. Lloyd Exporth. He is the former Foreign Minister of Canada, and most of you do remember well how he stood on our side in our darkest hours. The honorable members of the Canadian Parliament, thank you very much for being here with us tonight. Senators, members of the Canada-Kosovo Parliamentary Friendship Group, dear Laura Napokoro, co-chair of the program of the Charleston University. Dear Krenare Recaj, where is she? So thank you so much for engaging with and about Kosovo and the Albanian community here in Toronto and around. Dear ambassadors, members of the Kosovo Albanian Canadian community, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I came here today with my team, with the Ambassador of the Republic of Kosovo in Canada, with the General Consul of the Republic of Kosovo here in Toronto, to be among you and to be very happy to remember what Canada and Kosovo, when they built the most strongest bridge that can be imagined between our two nations. When I came here from a discussion in the Security Council of the United Nations in New York, I had the privilege to meet Prime Minister Trudeau at a conference organized by my colleague, the Foreign Minister of Canada, Mélanie Joly, my friend, with colleagues from all over the world on how to support Ukraine in this war and in this genocide that they are facing. Before I tell you what Prime Minister told to me, let me just say briefly and clearly, the world will be much worse and much more dangerous if we do not fulfill our duty, and that is to help the victim Ukraine against Russia, this aggressive Russia, and finally to defeat Russia and make Ukraine win. Because making Ukraine win means making our principles win, making good win against evil. And I'm glad that Canada is steadfast with us and so many others in this effort to make the evil lose and the better win. So when I met Prime Minister and I introduced myself, he immediately said, "Oh yes, I just finished a video message to the Albanian community," and we had the privilege to hear that message, and it was really a nice coincidence. But not only that we were together in the noble cause helping Ukraine, also Prime Minister Trudeau felt being excited about addressing our people from Kosovo in this special message. So we are celebrating 25 years of arrival of people who could have been dead, who could have become victims of genocide. Because the generosity of this very country, of Canada, of hundreds of Canadian families and helpers, they got a second chance for a new life and for the future of their kids. For what we could not be more grateful. In order to understand the magnitude of what was going on, let me tell you my own experiences in 1999. We had constantly warned the West this war was imminent. We had tried to lobby our Western friends to stop Milosevic from going against innocent civilians. The dictator did not hesitate to wage war, to commit genocide, to distract whole villages, to commit massacres with hundreds of people each. To give you just one example, there is a predominantly Catholic village in Kosovo with the name Meja. In this village alone, they have killed over just a few days more than 650 people. Children, people older than 90, women, just indiscriminately barbaric. When we saw Bucha in Ukraine, all the images flashed back. We had many of these massacres, very many, too many. Compared to the population of Canada, the people killed in our country in just 1.5 years would amount to about 300,000 people killed in this country. Additionally, some 400,000 women, children, and men systematically raped in these 18 months. And finally, half of the population expelled, meaning 20 million if you compare the figures to Canada's roughly 40 million people. It was horrific. We survived, and we came back even stronger. But we could only come back because we had friends who did not watch any longer what was going on, but came to our rescue. The proud nation of Canada was among those. And there is not often justification for sentences like, "We will be forever grateful," eternally, because we were on the brink to be eradicated as a people. Serbia wanted to extinct us, literally extinct us. So when the civilized world, civilized countries in NATO, came together and decided we need to do something, we are not going to let this genocide happen on our watch, that was one of the finest moments in the history of modern civilization. We have suffered immense horrors, but we have also experienced unbelievable friendship and gratitude. So when Canada opened its arms for our people in this existential threat, when Canada said, "We open our borders for some of you so that you will be secure, without fear, that our children can escape the horror and your family can build a secure and a hopeful, happy life here in Canada," that was like a gift from heaven. Yesterday, I was in Laval, near to Montreal. I met there with our community, and it was an impressive gathering, like it is here tonight. The venue was packed even despite Halloween, and we had a sincere talk among each other about Kosovo, obviously, but also about Canada, the new home. And what I can tell our Canadian friends, what all these Kosovar Canadians here in the room can confirm, that is common. Canada is not only home, but it is also in the hearts of families and the people who have been rescued from Kosovo, and in their hearts are also the families who have rescued people from Kosovo. Today they are busy, loyal, and successful contributors to the development of this wonderful country, Canada. At the same time, they are with their hearts as well in the country that they left, where their families come from, in Kosovo. So what Canada has achieved is a double victory. It is the victory that this country has immigrants so grateful and so loyal that they would do everything for Canada, inside and abroad. And again, it is a victory for Canada in the sense that you have made not only a new friend, but a friend who will never forget what you did for us. We have got your back, and you've got ours. This is how our catastrophe something very how out of catastrophe something very precious can evolve. This is how generosity wins over catastrophe. This is close to a miracle. This is a victory of humanity over barbaric genocide. We all are living in a better world, thanks to what Canada did. This is not only a win for Kosovo, it is a victory for civilization, what you did then. It's a coincidence, like in the talk with the Prime Minister, but maybe it's not just chance, but both of our countries in our Albanian language have their names start beginning with a K and ending with an A. Maybe we were meant to be. So therefore, let me gratefully thank you in our Albanian language with Faleminderit shumë Canada, and in your language, thank you very much Canada, et merci beaucoup Canada.
Thank you very much for those comments. We are honored to have a delegation from Kosovo with us tonight and deeply appreciate their presence, your presence. And we know that you must step away because you have travel arrangements, but we wanted to express our thank you first, and we hope that you can stay as long as possible before the airplane requirements insist that you depart. We would also like to extend a special welcome to the dignitaries who've taken the time to be with us here tonight. We have His Excellency Egiatik Kriezu, Ambassador of the Republic of Kosovo to Canada, Her Excellency Dr. Artemis Malo, Ambassador of Albania to Canada, His Excellency Agran Budjaku, Ambassador of North Macedonia to Canada, the Honorable Rob Oliphant, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Kyle Seaback, Member of Parliament for Dufferin-Carleton, the Honorable Aaron O'Toole, former Member of Parliament and leader of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition, the Honorable Dr. Lloyd Axworthy, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Art Eggleton, former Minister of National Defense, and Mr. Kadri Dakai, Consul General of the Republic of Kosovo in Toronto.
We also want to acknowledge the presence of everyone else gathered in this room tonight. Over the past few days, individuals have traveled from every single province in Canada, from the United States, from across Europe, and I found out tonight from Brazil, to be here with us tonight. Among us are retired diplomats and politicians who guided the intense negotiations during the Kosovo War, and veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces who stood on the front lines when diplomacy was not enough. With us tonight are Canadian immigration officials and doctors who traveled to Macedonia and Albania on very short notice, working tirelessly in crowded refugee camps to provide essential care. We're joined by Red Cross volunteers and workers, and members of the Department of National Defense and settlement support staff who ensured that Kosovar refugees arriving in Canada in 1999 found not only safety, but support. Here tonight are individuals who sponsored Kosovar refugees, offering what they had and even offering to open their homes. We are honored also to be joined by members of the Albanian diaspora who spent sleepless nights in the 1990s anxiously awaiting news of loved ones in Kosovo while courageously advocating for their protection at great personal risk. We're also joined by academics, members of the public, media, as well as representatives from the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 and the Canadian War Museum, who were not directly involved in the events 25 years ago, but who have taken the time to be with us here tonight. Finally, and most importantly, I want to acknowledge the presence of the Kosovar Albanian refugees here tonight themselves. Many lost homes, treasured belongings, and tragically loved ones. They faced unthinkable choices, leaving behind everything familiar for only a hope of safety. While we gather tonight to honor the contributions and commitments of Canadians during the Kosovo crisis, it is equally vital to recognize the courage and resilience of the Kosovar refugees themselves. They were not passive victims. They were agents of their own liberation, their own survival, and their own future. Kosovo's path to liberation would not have been possible without the extraordinary sacrifices and the strength of the Albanian people, who risked everything for their freedom. I am acutely aware that almost everyone in this room has a story worth sharing on this stage tonight. We have endeavored to present a diverse range of perspectives and voices that reflect the complexity of the experiences surrounding Kosovo. As organizers, we intend for this gala to be one of many initiatives aimed at weaving the story of Canada, Kosovo, and the Kosovar Albanians into the broader national narrative. The presence of a broad range of people with us this evening, both those involved in 1999 and those not, demonstrates the lasting significance of the events of 1999 and the shared commitment to remembering them.
Thank you for those comments, Kernara. As many of you know, I have the great pleasure of supervising Kernara's doctoral work, and so it's always a pleasure to hear you reflect on your community's history and the relationship between Canada and Kosovo. I have the great pleasure now of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Lloyd Axworthy, former Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I was saying to Dr. Axworthy earlier that I had the pleasure of picking up his book today and discovering that the first chapter, in fact, opens with reflections reflections on Kosovo and the very difficult decision-making that Dr. Axworthy was confronted with as Minister of Foreign Affairs. And the chapter in Dr. Axworthy's distinguished career, I think, offer us the opportunity to really reflect on the significance of the events in 1999, but not only what happened in 1999, the legacy of those events and what everyone is continuing to live in this moment. And so I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. Axworthy to the stage for his reflections.
Well, good evening, everybody. Let me begin by saying I'm really quite overwhelmed by the numbers of people from so many different backgrounds who have come to celebrate this anniversary. But as you know, anniversaries are not just for recollection and memory, they're also for reigniting and recommitting based on the lessons that those events provide. And I'm going to take up the invitation to tell a story amongst many. In 2017, I was invited to return to Kosovo by our ambassador to help celebrate sort of the independence and to have the rare opportunity that doesn't often come to politicians, which is to see the results of things you actually do and get a chance to understand their significance and their meaning. So Ambassador Nasisic said, look, I'm going to get together a cross-section of people in a fairly dingy but very warm, smoke-filled room, and we're going to have a conversation. Okay. And I just thought, here's an opportunity that is rare. So I said to the assembled group of variety of people, I said, I have a question for you. If we hadn't been involved in the NATO effort to stop the aggression of Milosevic, what difference has it made? Then a fairly grizzled guy, old guy, got at me and said, well, I can tell you that half of us wouldn't be here today. And that was the truth, that all of a sudden you realized that that simple act, which in its own way was a highly innovative breakthrough in diplomacy, where a coalition of countries came together in one of the most difficult decisions that is possible for ministers and governments to make, which is to put not only their own men and women in armed forces at risk, but also the risk of those who are going to be part of that conflict. It's tough. I'm glad that Art Eggleton is here, because he and I, during those days, we labored over that decision. And I recall during the course of that I received a call from Prime Minister Kretchen at the time, and he said, I'm meeting with a group of religious leaders in Canada who have come to tell us why we should not go to war, we should not fight, we should not exercise our option at protection. And it was an interesting exchange, because I know this sounds just a little kind of super academic, but we actually got into a discussion about just war, which took us back to the 4th century Thomas Aquinas religious teachings at the time. Can you imagine in a modern context that we're out there having a debate as to exactly what was the definition and outcome of applying a just war concept to what was happening? And what the conclusion was is that it actually required us to make a balanced judgment about the ability to use force. Now I have to tell you that I was not a pacifist, But I had a very strong aversion to war. I had grown up my fathers and uncles in the Second World War had all gone to war. And as a bratty kid growing up in Canada during wartime, I just realized just the enormous sort of pain and suffering that goes with it. But when it came down to this fundamental question, I also felt that as a member of an international community, we're going to be required to make some stands based on more than just transactional, expedient, practical, pragmatic, what works tomorrow, well, how's this going to sell in the Globe and Mail, but to actually make decisions that had some fundamental sort of sense of justice to it. And I have to tell you, I share this with you. That meeting sort of gave me a little sort of discombobulation. That's a big word. I didn't know how I was able to get it out. So I invited the minister of my local United Church, South Minister, some of you know, is just down across the bridge from Lansdowne Park. And his name was Jim Christie, and I said, will you meet me for lunch at the Ritz restaurant on the canal? And we engaged in a 2 or 3 hour discussion about what it meant in terms of someone who had a faith, that how that faith could be applied or should be applied. And it was out of that it really began to, I felt the genesis, the creation of that notion that I think fueled so much of our foreign policy at that point in time, and that is that the idea is that we had to provide a human security as well as a national security. Sure, we were always on the front lines when it came to defending the interests of the government or of the state, but increasingly it was apparent from the fact that we were doing peacekeeping in the Balkans at the time. There was at that time, I think, maybe 1,500 Canadian peacekeepers in the Balkans about that period. We were learning from them and what they were experiencing, because they weren't just there in terms of a military role, they were also being seen really as the civil guardians for the population. And it was all these things began to weave and meld together in a sense that we had to establish a much stronger commitment to the protection of people. And when Her Excellency stirringly gave her remarks earlier, I was struck by that fact that she really hit the nail on the head of saying, where are we today when around the world, in various parts, innocent people, men, women, and children, are being destroyed, killed, maimed, starved, for the ambitions of madmen, whether they are heads of government or heads of warlords or heads of militias, are using their power that they've acquired to basically destroy the lives of tens of thousands of people. And there was a period then where we had an opportunity as a country to stand up on that issue. And one plea I make to the group today is that as you come together in discussion tomorrow about what was the meaning of all that, realize that policies and judgments and decisions like that just don't happen. They happen because there's leadership. They happen because there's a sense of direction. They happen because there's been a commitment. One of the things that I think, again, I refer to my friend Art, is that what we knew as members of Mr. Kretschen's cabinet is that we had support by the Canadians. There was clearly members of the Serb diaspora weren't too happy with me. I mean, I had a few confrontations, which I talk about in the book, but I'm here to tell about it. But what was clear is that Canadians as a whole were saying that, yes, Canada has to play a role in dealing with the kind of viciousness and terror that was going on. And not only that, but I can see Rob Oliphant about to smile, we actually had a unanimous agreement of all parties in the House that this is something we should do. I mean, talk about sort of retreat back into history. But there was lessons there because those, again, that just didn't happen. It happened because there was an ongoing sort of understanding of what we as a country were capable of doing, that we had developed some sense that we were not going to be out there sort of flexing our muscles in grand power, great power exchanges of who's the toughest kid on the block and who can muscle people more than others. We realized that we had a different kind of role to play. And that's when we developed the human security idea, which is a UN concept, but we actually implemented. And so there's a couple of lessons I'd like to draw from that, just to share with you. Number one, the first one is just how important it was that we were able to draw upon real strengths that we had as a country. I begin with the strength that we had in the departments of external affairs and the Defense Department. We had really public servants who knew what they were doing, were dedicated, and had an outreach to their connections and networks of people around the world. Now, I'm saying that because each year since then, every time a budget comes out, that thin red line around the world is being shaved and cut, and all of a sudden, the ability, I'm not telling tales out of school, but our embassy in Belgrade during that period of time was an important source of intelligence and information that we were sharing with allies throughout the security. We were on the Security Council. We had been elected to the Security Council. Why? Because we committed to the other countries of the world that we were going to have a program, principle of human security. And we had the largest sort of voting in 99 of any countries. 80% of the countries voted for Canada to sit on the Security Council. And why? Because all of a sudden we had to sort of be conscious and win the trust of not only the Canadians, but also the trust of a lot of other people around the world, that we would be the avatars of that particular notion. But we relied upon a capacity, and we tend to forget now of just how important our capability to be a presence in the world means, not just for ourselves and our own security, but for everybody else. A second lesson, which I think was important that came out of it, is that there was, through serious diplomacy, an ability to help shape the decisions that were made. I recall the negotiations that went on around the formation of the NATO force. We had an overnight meeting. I think, Art, you were there, where we were up all night with our counterparts working on what would be the confines. And one of the key elements that was required is to say that if we were going to be engaged as a partner in a military action, we ought to make sure that that coalition initiative was clearly based on serious guardrails, controls, definitions. It drove some of the generals, especially the ones who had eagles on their shoulders, crazy that a group of foreign ministers and defense ministers would get together weekly and talk about target allocation. What do we know? We're a bunch of, bozo politicians from Winnipeg. But the reality is I think with one exception, a certain embassy in Belgrade that mistakenly got hit, we were able to have a highly controlled, highly defined way in which intervention would take place. And here's another lesson. That as we went through it, we were also deeply engaged in finding a reconciliation and negotiation to end it as quickly as we could. And again, there was an interesting Canadian role, because at the time, the sort of judge who was head of the tribunal for the Balkans sent me a note. I was in a drafty castle in Germany with a bunch of other NATO foreign ministers, and we were chatting away about we're in it now, we have to find an exit to get out of it, which again is something right now has some relevant lessons to the conflicts we're facing. Once you get in, how the hell do you get out? And all of a sudden I had this note that Milosevic and 5 of his cohorts had been indicted as war criminals. So I shared that information with my colleagues, and they said, "Oh my God, you Canadians, you're up to it again. What is going on?" And I said, "Well, let's see how this plays out." What did play out is all of a sudden that definition of holding Milosevic and his people accountable for international crime began to be part of the undermining and the erosion of his own political position and his own domestic system at home. The use of law, the use of criminal law against leaders and governments who use their power to destroy and transgress was brought into picture. And I have to tell you, probably one of the best kept secrets in Canada is that sort of statute of Rome for the International Criminal Court is embedded in our criminal code in Canada, and we could use it any time we want, except we don't. Okay, one final lesson, because I think you folks want to sort of get on with it and to the celebration to follow. It was that experience that led what I think to was one of the most interesting, provocative, and historic Canadian initiatives, because in discussing this in our cabinet, again with my colleague in defense and international developments, we realized that this kind of intervention for humanitarian purpose, realized none of us were going there because Kosovo had a big bank of special minerals or a big lake of oil or any other asset. It was simply that people were being murdered and expelled. Their own dignity and their own sense of who they were was being tortured. It was a clear, I know some people don't like to use the word, but it was a clear humanitarian intervention, protecting their rights. But the flaw in that particular exercise was that it was an ad hoc thing. We had to kind of do the kind of backroom negotiations because there was no rules, there was no protocol, there was no system, there was no way in which defines at what point in time is it proper and right that the governments of like mind with civil society and international institutions can come together to provide the protection of people. And again, it was through, I think, skillful diplomacy on part of our own departments. Our Paula Heimbecker, who was our assistant deputy minister, Bob Fowler at the UN, and we were on the council, so we had a real lever to play, decided that we would take a real sort of leap forward. And we established an international commission on sovereignty and intervention. Big title. Its basic job was to say, how do we establish rules of the game? How do we provide a clear set of definitions as to when, where, and how that kind of humanitarian intervention can take place, and how are those people who are involved in it are held accountable? And my own cabinet gave me a little bit of money, not much. We were in a deficit beating time. But I also negotiated about $40 million from American foundations to do serious research on just war to begin with. But we were able to come up with through that commission, made up of a broad range of people from around the world, north, south, east, west, of all different kind of backgrounds, to come up with what would be a consensus around which that protection of people could take place with a degree of regularity. It didn't have to be sort of put together every single time. And some of you would know that the outcome of that was the idea called responsibility to protect. It was an idea that had actually been forwarded by an Assistant Secretary General of the UN, a guy named Francis Deng, who said when a government is unable to protect its people, or when a government is unwilling to protect its people, or when a government is the predator itself, then that triggers a responsibility to protect. It means that is the signal, that is the way in which you cross the line to determine when and where and how do you provide various forms of reaction. And that report got into the UN system. Secretary General Kofi Annan became highly engaged because he saw this as very much an answer to what was going on in Bosnia and Macedonia, the different conflicts around the world. All of a sudden it opened up a whole new set of, a new toolbox by which the international community through the UN provides action. And part of our history that we don't pay much attention to is that in 2005, that concept of R2P, which, by the way, Martin Gilbert, the famous British historian, said was the most important adjustment to sovereignty of the last 150 years. That concept was approved unanimously by the summit of world leaders at the United Nations in 2005. We put the box together. We put the framework together. Now, there was going to be a lot of questions of implementation from that point on, and that's where the fumbling began to occur. But just realize that, because I heard several calls to action of saying, what is the responsibility of those who came from Albania and those who came from Kosovo and those who came from Macedonia, who have settled here knowing just what kind of threat and risk people are under? Where are the voices right now on requiring that we do the same thing for people who are faced with the same situation? Can any of you, how do we sit here tonight when we know that in Sudan there is a mass sort of extermination, mass community rape, mass starvation, mass famine going on, and the only action of the Western diplomatic states was to say, how do we get our diplomats out of the country? That's been our reaction. I mean, we have our international development people are putting money in, we're trying to support, but the overwhelming issue is that we've had this massive extermination going on, where we're now talking about hundreds of thousands of people being murdered. And I think we've become distracted, or we've become too comfortable, or we've become sort of too caught by a bunch of old lines, pro-nationalist, pro-my country first kind of theologies that have infected and put a virus into our political stream. So I want to, in a sense, say to you that as a community who's here to celebrate what happened 25 years ago, that still sort of has brought to this country a great richness of intellect and commitment and ideas. I think it's discussions like this that need to be happening more often, more frequently, in more parts of the country to say, okay, we learned about what happened in Kosovo. We did something. We helped make, as they said, half those people still alive, still able to walk the face of the earth. And what are we doing today? Have we exercised the same sense of judgment, of discretion, and of decision-making? And we're not always going to win them all. Diplomacy is not sort of a pinball game. It is always out there, but you have to come at it with a clear set of your values and a clear set of your capabilities and a clear set of your purposes. And you need to have public support, both in Parliament and then across the country, to make those kinds of initiatives work. And so I'm simply saying that I hope, I pray, that as you gather together in your discussions tomorrow, that this issue you'll take some sense of how do we translate the lesson of what happened in Kosovo and the protection that took place and the efforts that we were able to make because we had a first-class diplomatic corps, because we had a government committed to a liberal legal order, because we had a community in which we could find allies and friends and supporters. Her Excellency talked about the fact that there are governments out there, there are international institutions, but the convening of it, the gathering of it, I don't know. I give credit. I think Foreign Minister Joly just had a good meeting in Montreal this last week on Ukraine. But I'm simply saying, I think, and I'm not here to sort of proselytize, but the reason I wrote the book, and I hope some of you will read it, is that I said it's kind of a time for a reckoning in this country. It's time for us to look at who we are, that we've done wonderful things in the past, we've got great capabilities in the future, but are we really doing the things that we're really are? Are we doing the best that we can do? Or are we sort of taking, the side road? Are we simply doing things the comfortable way? And as you'll find out at the end of it, I'm simply saying, unless and until we establish a fundamental change in our human rights in our own country, which is the recognition of Indigenous people as a third pillar, founding people of Canada, and make sure that they are given those rights, we cannot as a country continue to live as a lie in the last 150 years until we come to grips with that big issue. Is it going to happen in the next election? I know, Rob, I don't think so. But I got to tell you, there is a lot of interest. One of the things about doing a book is you get to tour. I'm not sure that's always a blessing. It is tonight. But what I am finding is I talk to students at universities and members of book clubs, and I'm finding that Canadians, I think they're looking for something. They're looking for something that makes a difference. Whether it's, I'm thinking of when I was a young cabinet minister, being part of a government that did the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, who fought the free trade deal, but it was something where Canadians for 2 years came to a major decision defining this country. I think Canadians are looking for some of that new definition, and I think that it is gatherings, assemblies, conversations such as you're organizing today that can help bring about that kind of reckoning that the country needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Axworthy, for those really insightful and thoughtful comments. I'm struck by the ways in which the policymaking unfolded were connected, and so to be able to hear about the responsibility to protect and that doctrine and the way it evolved based on some of the conversations around Kosovo in particular is really, I think, useful for us as we think about the present. We do have to say goodbye to our delegation from Kosovo. Thank you so much for being here. We wish you safe travels and to future conversations and friendships. Thank you very much. And we're doing all kinds of logistical maneuvering up here because Dr. Axworthy has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. And so we're going to move the podium. And so please have your questions ready. There'll be a mic circulating. So we have mics circulating. Our colleague Rebecca is going to come to you, and if you could please introduce yourself so we can get to know each other. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Angela Mondu. I'm an ex-military logistics officer, and I served in the UNPROFOR mission with former Yugoslavia. And you made a couple of comments that I just thought were so very striking in terms of the purpose we had as Canadians 25 years ago or longer, and the role we played with human security. So in today's world, how does Canada gain that strength of purpose that we had back in those years when many of us are here this evening served?
I think it'd be a very good idea to get back into peacekeeping. Right now, I think of some 60,000 people doing peacekeeping around the world. There are 28 Canadians involved. And I don't want to go back into sort of nostalgia and history, but we were the leading peacekeeping country for years. Mike Pearson got started? No. Is that better?
Oh yeah, much better.
That's right, because my hearing aid kept pushing back on his mind. And right now, I believe I'm right. Could be correct. I think there's only 3, maybe 5 Canadians in the NATO in Kosovo itself. And yet, I remember that my very first initiative overseas after Prime Minister Kuchma made me foreign minister was to the Balkans. And I stayed at the military camp and went out with our peacekeepers. And I discovered that not only were they smart and tough, but they also understood the reason why they're there, that peacekeeping for them was something, really was a security issue. And I really acquired a sense of just how important that dynamic between diplomacy and peacekeeping really had to work. And we tried to bring a third element into, which is our international development. And one of the less successful efforts I made as a foreign minister was to be able to get the 3 ministers to sit down at any one time and come to agreements, although I think we required a few of it. But I would start there. You know, there was a time when we had in Cornwall, Nova Scotia, the Peterson Peacekeeping Center became not just a center for training, but for research, for developing new concepts of thinking through where and how does it work. And one of the things that came up is that when we became a member of the Security Council in 1999-2000, we discovered that one of the great failures that had taken place in the Balkans, and many of you will remember this, was the horror sort of massacre of the young sort of Bosniaks in the caves, because the United Nations peacekeeping did not have the mandate to actually intervene on behalf of people. They could protect themselves. And that became the primary objective of our Security Council tenure. And we got, I think it was 1252 passed, which enabled UN peacekeepers to take sort of careful, balanced, but clear intervention on the behalf of protecting people. And I think the peacekeeping role is as important as being a warrior role. And I think that, and I also believe that right now there's a lot of young Canadians who would be inspired by that opportunity to become, and maybe peacekeeping not just in the classic sense that we were talking about, dealing with conflict, but wearing green helmets in terms of dealing with climate disasters. We have Ron, you can tell me, we had a DART program run by the Department of Defense that provided virtually a 36-hour capacity to go to areas of disaster. It's been sitting on the shelf for the last several years because Treasury Board thinks it costs too much money. Now, I don't want to be the advocate of explosive expenditure, but I'm telling you that what that DART capacity did is that whether it's in Haiti or Mali or in the earthquakes in Italy, the DART initiative became one of the most important signals that Canada was committed to working with other countries and to be there in time of need. So the point is, I guess what I'm making to answer your question, we can't simply use the rhetoric, we have to walk the talk. We have to say we really are committed in terms of the protection of people, and we have to show we are. We simply can't say, it's a great idea, and let's celebrate it on anniversary occasions. I think we have to actually be in the field making it work. And I would start with a revitalization of our capacity for peacekeeping, maybe with a much broader mandate.
Oh no, it's all you.
Go ahead. Hi, thank you very much for taking my question, just at the back here.
Oh, you're right.
Could you introduce
Yeah,
yourself?
Could you stand up so I
Sure. My name is Paul Prasad. I am a student at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here in Toronto. Just a student at the University of Toronto. I just have a quick question. Maybe I was hoping you could elaborate on what an increased Canadian capacity in KFOR would look like. Because right now, as you mentioned, there's about 4 troops or 5 troops. I'm wondering how exactly would Canada contribute to KFOR? Because right now we have the Hungarians that are leading that effort, the Italians that are leading that effort, but Canada has really dwindled out, and I'm just curious as to what that would look like.
Well, part of your question is operational, because mission by mission, and I don't pretend to, have the details. But what I see happening is that as the issues or the threats and risks themselves become much more catastrophic. There isn't a part of the world anymore that is escaping these kind of wild storms and floods and desolations and famines. Is that increasingly we have to mobilize our international efforts about meeting those, and therefore we need to have people skilled in those areas. And I think that one of the things, and this is, I asked for indulgence because I wrote about it, so I want to tell you what I wrote in a sense. I was saying that one of the capacities I had when I was a minister, a foreign minister, is that when we saw or felt there was an emerging risk or threat or problem, that I was given the mandate, as we did on landmines and other things, but also on the protection of child soldiers, to bring into the Department of Foreign Affairs a whole different selection of people with their own levels of talent and skill. Landon Pearson, who eventually became a senator, became my advisor on children at war. We were able to set up the Sam Nutt's kind of program that we're doing on war children. We were the primary mover and driver of protecting of kids in wartime. We're not anymore. But that means that we had to recruit people, we had to invest in people. And one of the things that really kind of breaks my heart a little bit is that when I've been asked what I thought were some of my accomplishments when I was in foreign affairs, I still think that one of the best things I did was establish an annual internship program where 2,000 young men and women from our schools and universities could spend 3 or 4 months working in our embassies, working in NGOs, working on development programs, working on legal programs, working on developing refugee settlements in Canada. We were involving young men and women in this country in helping to solve some of the problems. We weren't talking about it. We weren't sort of rhapsodizing. We were simply saying, you have to help solve it. And I still think that that's a missing link right now in the way governments work. We don't involve Canadians enough in the kind of initiatives. And if I can just totally kind of sidle sideways, I was also a Minister of Immigration for 4 years. And I thought probably one of the great sort of Canadian initiatives was the idea of sponsorship, and some of you have talked about it. Sort of Kosovars coming here, we're being able to meet with Canadian sponsors, get not only support for a house or health care, but also get Canadians working together with them in terms of saying we're becoming friends. And so all the kind of crazy rhetoric that's out there, listen to the Donald Trumps of the world and the Orbans of the world talking about vermin and rapists. I mean, come on. What we discovered through a sponsorship program, we had tens of thousands of Canadians working with refugees, understanding that they were people who came here with a commitment to do something good for themselves and their families. And we weren't buying in to that xenophobic, rabid nationalism that's driving so much of our politics around the world. And that's where I think governments do have a role to play in sponsoring, initiating, and in the sponsorship program, taking it out of mothballs and putting it really back in as the major pathway by which we provide entry for people seeking sanctuary and asylum.
I'm going to interject quickly and thank you very much for underscoring the significance of sponsorship. I think it's a really important dimension. I'm also going to say, I think we have time for one last question, but I want to highlight Dr. Axworthy's beautiful book, My Life in Politics, and there will be a book signing after the event this evening, and I think probably opportunity for more questions and dialogue with you. We're constrained for time, but we're looking forward to one last question.
Thank you. And it makes me proud to say that I'm a member of the...
Stand up?
Sure.
Sure, thank you.
I'm a member of the Kosovar diaspora. My family moved to Edmonton in the 1990s to escape conflict. I think so many of us here know what it's... We see war crimes for what they are. We know what genocide looks like. We know what occupation looks like. And I so appreciate you speaking about the difficulty in us living in this contemporary time, seeing conflicts that are happening. And what makes it particularly difficult for us is we were beneficients of the selfless involvement and the presence of the Canadian Armed Forces and the Canadian government for us in the 1990s and beyond. And now it's just a bit of a frustrating, difficult situation for diaspora Kosovar Albanians, seeing that our government is actually indirectly implicated in war crimes, specifically against occupied Palestine, for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And so could you just speak to, what you think has happened in this time, or why in some cases we can be supporting humanitarian good and in other cases be actually involved in perpetrating crimes against civilians, specifically the Palestinians? Thank you.
I think you said it all. You don't need a response from me. You really did. I'll just make one footnote on it, which I think is, again, a contemporary issue, and that is that immigration is clearly, and I speak to some of the members of parliament here who are involved in it, it's becoming a third rail issue and increasingly being used as a way of, as a former immigration minister, and as one I chair a group called the World Refugee Migration Council. We've made a serious mistake in using immigration to solve other problems. What do I mean? Well, in COVID, there was a clear demand for workforce in retail areas. Strong demands that were being made, and so we simply opened up the system to do it. But if you're opening up the system, there was no adjustment that went with it. There was no support system that went with it. We had one of those kind of moments that I comment on, where in 2016, with Justin Trudeau's government coming in, you had Dominic Barton from McKinsey briefing the cabinet and the caucus about how the future of Canada was to have 100 million people as quickly as we could get there. Okay, Dominic, and where are they going to live? And who's going to pay for the health care? And then where are they going to work? And we bought totally into that craziness, so that we all of a sudden sort of doubled, tripled our intake. And finally, and I'm saying this as a former university president, which I was for 10 years, provinces had put in the most rigorous sort of tuition freeze. I had, in my own province of Manitoba, every year there was a freeze in tuition and the granting of it. So what was happening is our universities and colleges were going broke. And people said, well, we have to find some way of financing. So what do? Let's triple the number of international students and make sure that the provinces and the universities can gouge them along the way. And all of a sudden, the same question was, where are they going to live? What's going to be their rights once they're here? Do they have the right of being documented? Do they have... And so we were solving a problem of financing of higher education by using immigration. I kept saying, immigration is something, it's a comment I make in the book, and I won't, because you could get me off on this for a long time. Ron Atke, who was the immigration minister under Joe Clark, after the election, and I bet you remember this, he took me out for lunch. We did things in those days. We had lunch across the Commons. And I remember Ron saying, he said, you know, immigration is a sacred trust. He said, part of that sort of sacred trust is to ensure that the rights of those who come are defended. The other part of the trust is to give assurance to Canadians that the system is being managed well and effectively. And he said, that's the balance wheel. And I go, and I think we lost that particular equation. And I'm not sure we're regaining it by the sort of kind of efforts we're now making, which is to, okay, if you're deciding you're going to cut back on all your international students, that's a policy. But what are you going to replace it with? Where's the money going to? And I'm told, I meet with a group of former university presidents. We get together every 3 months in the kvetch maybe is the right word. And there's about 8 or 9 universities in this country that could go bankrupt in the next 12 months. Simply because they were so reliant on international students. That's now been cut back by a third. And furthermore, our reputation as a place to come to, all those smart men and women from around the world who said, let's go to Canada, that's the place to go, they're not coming anymore. And all of a sudden our higher education system is in deep sort of disorder. And at some point we have to bail it out. And it's not, but we should stop using immigration to solve other problems and other issues. That's my lament for the evening.
Thank you so much for answering questions, and I'm sure you'll take more. I just want to note that I'm struck by the connections in your talk. You talked about the responsibility to protect as a global doctrine, and here we are talking about our responsibilities to immigrants and to protecting their rights. So thank you for the full circle connections. We're going to take a couple of minutes to reorganize the stage, but thank you for taking the time.
What happens on the stage next?
So it's going to be a surprise.
Are we having dancing?
Yeah, it's a surprise. So just give us a couple minutes. Thank you again for your generosity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Dr. Axworthy for your insightful reflections and for reminding us of the crucial role Canada played on the world stage during the Kosovo War. We are grateful for your contributions to both Canada and Kosovo. As we reflect on the collaborative efforts that shaped Canada's response in 1999, it is essential to acknowledge the critical role of the military. Next, we have a video message from current Minister of National Defense, the Honorable Bill Blair, who wanted to be here tonight but unfortunately could not.
Good evening, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'd like to thank Carleton University, the Embassy of Kosovo, the Canadian Immigration Historical Society, the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21, and representatives from the Kosovar Albanian community for organizing this symposium to mark the 25th anniversary of the arrival of Kosovar Albanians to Canada and the Kosovo War, a war in which we tragically saw the death and displacement of thousands. Since Kosovo declared independence in 2008, our two countries have forged a strong friendship founded on a shared commitment to peace, freedom, and democracy. Canada takes great pride in its ongoing support to the Kosovo Force, the NATO-led peacekeeping mission in Kosovo. We are proud of the military personnel and civilians from Canada who have dedicated themselves to shaping a better future for Kosovo. And tonight, we celebrate you and all of the people dedicated to building peace and stability. During the war, members of the Canadian Armed Forces worked with our allies to bring stability and security to the region. And today, we honor the service and sacrifice of these members, 30 of whom are in the room with us this evening. From combat missions to humanitarian and peacekeeping work, your efforts have helped build a better future for our friends in Kosovo. During the Kosovo War, members of our military flew in combat missions over the former Yugoslavia, and they participated in the NATO-led Operation Allied Force. Other CAF members were deployed on the ground in Kosovo, assisting in rebuilding efforts through Operation Kinetic. Canada was proud to support Kosovo and to assist in rebuilding after the war so that those displaced by the war could return home. The CAF members being honored at tonight's event and the Kosovar Albanians they served alongside helped bring peace to a region that has been torn apart by war, and they helped thousands of Kosovar Albanians to begin a new life. Your efforts will never be forgotten, and we are grateful for your service. Thank you. Merci.
Next, please join me in welcoming to the stage the Honorable R. Eggleton, who, as Minister of National Defense in 1999, provided leadership and played a key role in Canada's military contributions in Kosovo and the Department of National Defense's role in welcoming Kosovar refugees. We are lucky to have him here with us tonight to share his reflections.
Well, thank you very much, Renar, and congratulations to you and to Carleton University with the support of the Bill Graham Center for putting on this symposium and this gala this evening. Now, 25 years ago, I first saw Kosovo from the air in a Canadian Forces helicopter. What I saw was very disturbing. I saw people coming down the roads from Kosovo into northern Macedonia, into refugee camps, to get away from the persecution, to get away from the attacks, to get away from the possibility of them and their families being killed. From being a victim of the kind of attacks that the government of Serbia was supporting other people to take. Ethnic cleansing is what it was called, and it was horrible. Now, in addition to seeing all of those people streaming out of Kosovo, men, women, and children with whatever belongings they could bring together, I looked further, and you could see smoke, fire, you could see houses burning, you could see communities burning. These people were coming from that fate. And I said, surely we can't let this continue. But then I remembered also the experiences that we had in Rwanda, the genocide that occurred there, Srebrenica in Bosnia, slaughtering of thousands upon thousands of people. And I said, surely to God, we can't let this continue. Fortunately, I had colleagues like Lloyd Axworthy in Foreign Affairs, the Prime Minister, and others in our cabinet and our parliament and throughout the country who said the same thing. This is not what we stand for in Canada. We stand for human rights. We stand for the defense of people and their lives. Innocent people should not be subjected to this kind of horrible circumstance. And we had some people that could carry out the wishes of the three of us and the other members of government. And they were the fine, dedicated men and women of our Canadian forces. Plus, we had people from our police forces, all engaged to help bring peace and security back to Kosovo. And that is mainly why I'm here tonight. I'm here to honor them for their contribution. And one final thing. Lloyd mentioned the responsibility to protect. It was in evolution at the time. It was about 6 years before it would be finally part of United Nations doctrine. But it did eventually reach that status. But again, we said, we can't wait. We can't wait for that. There are people dying here every day. So we got involved. So let me finally say, now that that's 25 years behind, I wish all of the people of Kosovo peace and security for the rest of your days. And the many Kosovars, or Kosovo Albanians who continue to reside in this country and make a solid contribution to our Canadian values. Thank you very much. Now, Krenar and I are going to do this together.
Tonight, we are honored with the opportunity to recognize 14 members of the Canadian Armed Forces and law enforcement personnel who served in Kosovo. When your name is called, if you would please stand if you are comfortable doing so. Audience, please hold your applause until the end.
Okay. There are 14 people, right?
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's start with the leadership at the top, and that was, although everybody counts here, I got to tell you. And that starts with Major General, he's retired, of course, as I am too, Major General Mike Ward. He was the commander of our task force in Kosovo. Lieutenant Colonel Billy Flynn. Now, as you know, we not only had people on the ground, but we had people in the air. In fact, for 78 days before Milosevic finally gave in, that was our major effort. There was some 684 flight missions, and Lieutenant Colonel Billy Flynn was in charge of that. Thank you very much, sir. Lieutenant Colonel, it all says retired here, so I'm not going to say that again. Lieutenant Colonel Tim Batchko. But I got to tell you, he's from the Royal Canadian Dragoons, okay? And then Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Jones from the Royal Regiment of Canada. You notice nobody's holding their applause. I didn't think they would. He brought his own cheering section. Okay, and then Lieutenant Colonel David Quick, the Royal Canadian Regiment. Always at the back. Major Cheryl Netterfield, the Task Force Medical Advisor. Right there. Captain Dermot Coombs, the Royal Canadian Regiment. Captain Patricia Viscount, Public Affairs Officer. Chief Warrant Officer, oh, they're important people too, obviously, I remember them. Paula Carpenter. Chief Petty Officer, First Class, Robert Keenan. Warrant Officer Dave Kennedy from the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Now we get into the police force. Toronto Police Service to start with. Staff Sergeant Brian Kenny. Now, he was the chief of traffic enforcement in Kosovo during this mission. We could use you right now in Toronto. Okay, so Sergeant Dana Gidlow from Toronto Police Services and the Military Veterans Association. And finally, I hope nobody's left off here, is Corporal Jonathan Murphy, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry.
Thank you again to all of those who are here who risk their safety and security to come to the aid of their allies and the most vulnerable among us. Their contributions saved lives and helped to underline the solidarity of NATO alliance when facing crimes against humanity and challenges to the international order. Our next speaker served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 23 years. He will share his memories of the Kosovo War as he commanded the Canadian Task Force in Aviano, Italy, during Operation Allied Force. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Colonel Billy Flynn.
Thank you, Crenera. I'm going to go off script right off the bat. Lieutenant Colonel Rob Parker, stand up, please. My fellow warrior. Another one of our Kosovo veterans. Good evening, bonsoir tout le monde. Two thank yous. Crenera, thank you for organizing all of this. And the second thank you is on behalf of the hundreds of men and women of the Canadian Task Force Aviano, or as we like to call ourselves, the Balkan Rats. The fighter pilots, the technicians, and the support personnel who fought in Operation Allied Force now 25 years ago. It brings me here, full circle in a life as a combat aviator, to come listen about the lives that you have lived, to hear your stories, and to understand the people that we helped save. And I thought I would take my remarks and talk about three things: flying combat, how it all went for us, and what it all means today. And most of what you know about fighter aviation you've seen in Hollywood movies, or maybe you went to an air show once upon a time. But modern aerial warfare is an extraordinary orchestration of anywhere from 50 to 70 fighter jets flying up at a sanctuary 25 to 30,000 feet at supersonic speeds, executing surgical precision weapons with extraordinary lethality. And Operation Allied Force was a combination, a coalition of NATO air forces that was sent to deal with our particular problem. And it's an incredible coordination effort to get jets taking off from different countries and different fighter bases, all to amass as one, to enter, in our case, Kosovo and Serbia, to attack our targets and leave an egress and go back home safely. And Canadians had a significant part of this operation. We were 2% of the entire military force, and we flew more than 10% of the missions. And we Canadian CF-18 pilots led more than half the time of the missions we flew. We were in charge of those mass attack formations. As was mentioned, we flew nearly 900 combat sorties, and we would have flown more, but the weather was so atrocious in the spring of 1999. And when you're delivering precision-guided weapons, you have to see the targets on the ground to be able to direct those bombs to where they're going to go. And the weather was so bad that we canceled far more than we wanted. And today the CF-18 is a tired, old, 40-year-old workhorse, no longer survivable in combat. But 25 years ago, it was an incredibly lethal, agile fighter with the most sophisticated capabilities anywhere in the world. And there are many of us, as you've just recognized, that spent a career in the profession of arms. And in a non-warring nation, we would spend potentially a lifetime training for a mission that may never come. And in the case of some of us, we spent more than a decade and a half training for what was 78 days of combat, in my case, 25 combat missions. And it was an incredibly dangerous place because the Serbs were desperately trying to shoot us down and kill us. And they were dangerous missions to fly. And it speaks to the incredible professionalism and talent of the Canadian fighter pilots that we came home safely at the end of all this. And we had jets to fly every day because of the single greatest performance from our maintenance, our ground crew, our technicians, that we had jets to fly. The single greatest performance in 100 years of the Canadian Air Force. And it took effectively the entire logistics and transport capability of the Canadian Air Force to resupply us with the bombs and the spare parts we needed to operate at the high tempo that we were operating. So that's what fighter flying is like. But how did it go? Well, I was in the operations center at the first night of the war, and you know what? We thought it was going to last a week. It would maybe have been 10 days, and the Serbs were going to give up. But our commanders misunderstood the complexity of aerial warfare, and we did not understand the resolve of the Serbian forces. And we fought a 24-hour-a-day war. We started with targets in Kosovo, military targets, and expanded into Serbia. But we weren't making progress, and we decided that the Serbian people had to feel the full force of what NATO's might was capable of. And then we turned it on to them. And we made mistakes, make no mistake about it, because you saw them on CNN all over television the next day when bombs went where they were not intended to be, or pilots made mistakes. And I give full credit to the Serbian forces because they were wily. They shot down an F-117 stealth fighter thought to be nearly invisible, and one of my fellow squadron commanders was shot down in an F-16, and they damaged other airplanes. And it took the concerted effort of our NATO forces to focus and drive, ultimately, the Serbian forces to give up. And that's all fine, but I always ask, what does it mean? What is all this important about? Look, aerial combat, as I said, is a very sophisticated orchestration of effectively video game technology flowing up at a sanctuary where we are sterile from the real world. And we did not know what happened on the ground. And at best for us, we would see a replay of the displays we had in our cockpits that were recorded, and we would see those after our missions and our debriefs and see where our bombs went. But we didn't know your horror. We didn't see the evil that you saw. We didn't understand your suffering. And we're an Air Force that's 100 years old. Look, everything that we know about combat, it comes from World War I and World War II, where it was very clear distinction between good and evil, right? Very black and white in our history. And we didn't understand the complexity of the cultures involved in where you were. And I can tell you that when politicians from Ottawa are going to send you to a faraway land where your homeland is not threatened and your way of life is not at jeopardy, that's a very difficult conversation to have with yourself, with your family, or as the commanding officer of the men and women that you are taking into combat. But what do we know as Canadians? Well, we know evil, don't we? And we know that we are a strong, prosperous, powerful nation, and that we know that we have an obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And that's how we knew what we were doing was right. And that's how we knew, as fighter pilots, the 69 of us that climbed up the ladder, that put themselves at risk to go into harm's way, that's how we knew what we were doing is right. Because everyone has a right to the life that we understand as Canadians and the values that we believe in as Canada. And so I'm here on behalf of those hundreds of men and women. I'm here to close the circle of combat of my existence 25 years later, to celebrate your lives that you have lived, the stories that you have, and to understand and celebrate with you. I'm here on behalf of those hundreds of men and women of Operation Allied Force, all of us. So thank you. I am deeply touched to be a part of this, and thank you so much for including me in this.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Billy Flynn, for sharing this. I grew up hearing the story of my parents on the first night of the NATO bombing, and I always asked them, were you afraid? And they said, no, we felt, of course they were afraid, but no, we felt hopeful. But we also always wondered who were in the planes, who were risking their lives for us. We were hidden in a basement, but we knew that someone was in those planes, and 25 years later, meeting you has been a great honor, and having you speak here has been a great honor too. Operation Allied Force and the AIR campaign was just the beginning of Canada's military contributions and commitment to peace in Kosovo. Our next speaker will discuss Canadian contributions in Kosovo after the AIR campaign ended. Please join me in welcoming Major General Mike Ward, who commanded Task Force Kosovo during Operation Kinetic.
Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the honor that you bestowed upon us collectively tonight for something that was relatively modest and minor, I think, to all of us in those days. It was impactful and it was important, don't get me wrong. But 25 years later, many of us haven't thought back to the extraordinary events that took place through that year and a half leading up to the bombing campaign, and then the entry of NATO forces and the recovery of Kosovo to a nation that it is today. And so this gathering is a phenomenal event, and we can't thank you enough for including us in it. And a special thanks to you, Krenara, for all the tremendous work you've done to help shape this tonight. I'll tell you, it's been a bit of a struggle, a personal struggle, walking that all back to what was going on in those days, and to try and put that down onto a couple of sheets of paper and then share that with you in a few minutes. I'm probably not going to do a great job at it, but I do want to share a couple of reflections that reflect on what it was that we were all feeling on the ground as we got up, as we went out to do our duties, and as things progressed through the period of time, June of 1999 through until about June 2000, an extremely dynamic part of Kosovo history. I want to talk about security. I'm going to mention war crimes and war crimes investigations, humanitarian assistance, which isn't normally our bag, but I think it bears on the discussions that we're having, and community relations, which are essential, and I think that actually reinforces some of the points that our ministers have made in their comments tonight. So who were we? You've met 15 or so of us tonight, but we were a force of 1,500 soldiers in Kosovo for a 6-month tour. Ultimately, over 3,000 Canadian military personnel served in Kosovo for that year that Canada had deployed ground forces there. Many of us had experience in the former Yugoslavia, from 8 years in Bosnia and Croatia, and so we had a sense for what this conflict was all about. And we had a sense for the role that we would have to play if we were going to make a difference. In addition, over 100 Canadian civilian police deployed from their municipal police forces, national and federal police forces, in order to do things that were essential to returning law and order and developing public safety and the institutions of things like the Kosovo Police Service. Our first troops arrived in Macedonia with no expectation of an operation kicking off in about the middle of May, late May, 1999. We deployed on spec. There was a tremendous amount of operational planning going on in NATO for peacekeeping, peace support operations, and there are fine lines between the two of those, and potentially up to all-out war. And in the final analysis, quite fortunately, we didn't have to follow that option. When I think about going from the bombing campaign to boots on the ground, we salute the air forces that created those conditions that forced the Serbs to the table after such an extraordinary length of time, 78 days of bombing, that anybody would want to withstand that and still not bend to the will of the international community is extraordinary. On the ground in Macedonia, we brought a significant amount of capability with us that we would use for war, but which became quite useful in the peace support operation that unfolded subsequently. That included infantry soldiers for close protection and security operations on the ground. It included reconnaissance and surveillance, very high-tech reconnaissance and surveillance so that we could monitor what was going on in the areas of operations. Construction and combat engineers to help with demining, and also to assist with recovery of institutions. It also included, funnily enough, main battle tanks, and that probably threw a bit of a scare into people back home. But main battle tanks were things that were well understood in Kosovo and in that part of the world, and they brought with it an expression of commitment and seriousness that we anticipated that the technical agreements that all of the parties had signed up to were going to be followed. We didn't have to use the tanks, happily. We had a sense of purpose and a mission focus, and that was clear from day one, and it carried on through the 365 days we were there. In that first year of the mission, it was chaos most days. We thought we had a handle on what was going on, and we would wake up the next day and something completely different was happening. And so it became almost a game of whack-a-mole, but it also relied on us using our professional skills, capabilities, and leadership to adapt, to overcome, and to continuously progress as things changed on the ground. The key to our success, I would suggest, is our ability to maintain objectivity and at the same time balance that with empathy. You have many, many different factions operating on the ground, and a lot of them want to have a go at each other, but we've passed the stage at which we can comfortably allow vigilantism and revenge-seeking to go on if there's going to be some return to normalcy or there's going to be some development towards peace and security. And so we kept everybody honest in accordance with what they'd signed on to in terms of those technical agreements. And we were essentially the referee in many of those arbitrations. I would say we enjoyed the wholehearted support of Canadians, right from the very top, our politicians, our Prime Minister who called me late one night on the satellite phone to wish us well, to say that he understood what it was we were heading into, and he wanted Canadians to know that everybody back home was rooting for us. Our ministers, Ministers Axworthy and Eggleton, who shared their time with us in theater to understand intimately what it was that we were doing and what impacts those were having. And we also had a visit from our Governor General, Adrian Clarkson, to award the medals to our members as we were on the ground, completing that first rotation. Now, as I said, from bombing to boots on the ground, the bombing was especially successful in changing the strategic narrative. Very tough negotiations then took place, and you'll hear tomorrow morning from Ambassador Wendy Gilmore, who was party to those negotiations, about how difficult it was to get to a situation where you could get the Serbs on the one hand to agree to withdraw, you could get the Kosovo Liberation Army to agree to disband, to allow the entry of NATO forces, and the entire will and support of the international community to be able to move back in and get to work. The situation was highly fluid, but we got those military technical agreements signed, and then we got rolling in very, very short order. What we didn't anticipate was the determination of the displaced persons, almost 800,000 of which were living in displacement camps in and around Kosovo. And they saw that it was time to move and go home, and they up stakes, and they really went hell for election to get back in. At the same time as we were trying to get NATO forces in to prevent any to support the cessation of hostilities, and also to allow international organizations, governmental organizations, and NGOs in to assist with the humanitarian support. So it was a bit chaotic. But as I said, we adapted and we overcame. We were extremely impressed with the determination of the Kosovar Albanians, knowing that they were heading back into a very uncertain circumstance. There were no support mechanisms at all. There was no gas. There was no electricity. There were no grocery stores. There were no hospitals. There were no police. It was heading back in to try and put the essence of life back together. And I know, Ambassador, we spoke in June in Ottawa, and you lived that very personally in and around Malyshevo, I think, where you grew up. Our first job, our first priority was to establish security on the ground. So we wanted to make sure that as Serb forces left, there was no gap that was created. We had no police to help with law enforcement, and so we used military forces to do that. Military forces are at best a blunt force instrument and not ideal under the circumstances, but they were sufficient for what we needed. So a patrol would be 10 soldiers, and they would be in a hot spot. They would be vectored into places where revenge killings were ongoing or attacks, and they would take the situation in hand. A little bit later, as the civilian police mission got up and running, we would begin to blend in civilian police to that section. So you'd have 2 international police, 10 soldiers, and you'd be trying to introduce public order on a more precise scale than what the soldiers were able to do. Still later, those patrols became 4 international police, and later still, when the Kosovo Police Service was set up and established, it would be a joint patrol between international police and the Kosovo Police Service. And that was extremely effective, but it was also reflective of the fact that the security conditions were permissive at that level. Security operations were really our raison d'etre for the entire 12 months, but it's not the only thing that we did. We assisted with the humanitarian side because we had capacity to do that. In our battle group area, in fact, our main base area in the Drenica Valley in Donja Kurica, we had a civil military cooperation team whose role was to get out into the community, take patrol reports, and get a sense for what was needed in order to be able to improve the circumstances of the people who were returning to their homes. The UN took a considerable amount of time to flow field staff in to be able to take care of those roles, and so we filled in the interim. Not to compete with them, but to establish the conditions around which progress was being made on a steady basis. And so they actually set up a coffee tent, invited all the non-governmental organizations in 1 day a week. They had a massive map, and they had little circles about where each of those non-governmental organizations were operating, and they could clearly identify where the gaps were. And so what they would then do is horse trade with each of the NGOs to say, well, I know you came here and your specific mandate was to do this, but how about if you just expanded by about 500 meters there, and you would take care of that small hamlet as well. And gradually what we were able to do is to make sure that there was a common standard that helped all of those people be able to move. Neighbors would not understand necessarily where a boundary was, and therefore, they wouldn't understand why they weren't getting the assistance that their neighbors were. And we needed to make sure that we were being much more balanced in that regard. The most significant problem that we dealt with on the humanitarian side was the fact that winter was coming, and most of the homes had been destroyed to the extent that the roofs were burned out, the windows had all been broken, and somehow families were expected to survive through that. So we worked with the international community to distribute roofing kits, window kits, and heaters to at least be able to sustain people when the cold set in. We believe strongly in community works projects as well. And interestingly enough, and I take your words, Minister Axworthy, about children are a critical piece in the international security space that we're talking about here tonight. And it just seemed that many of our initiatives, homespun initiatives, focused on helping kids. The first thing we did was we We fixed up the local school. Kids had not been to school in years. And so we cleaned it up, got the desks, blackboards, et cetera, going, and they were able to put kids back in school within the next week. This had a profound effect on the elders in the community. We did mine awareness training because the unexploded ordnance that littered the communities was of great danger to civilians, and that helped. Some of our members established a Boy Scout, Girl Scout troop in order to provide the kids just a little bit of escape from the difficulties that they were facing each and every day. And each of those really demonstrated to our neighbors in the Albanian community, Kosovar Albanian community, that we were there not just to do the security job, but we were actually there to stand side by side with them and make that happen. Another aspect of that first 12 months was a significant amount of investigation by the International War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in order to be able to bring evidence that would favor indictments for Slobodan Milosevic and their elders. And our troops, side by side with forensic scientists and police, participated in the exhumation of those remains and helped bring those people to justice eventually. That's probably the most compelling reflection that I could share with you, was to understand the potential for man's inhumanity to man. And when within a community there's intolerance, where intolerance leads to mistrust, that mistrust creates fear, that fear causes neighbors to turn on neighbors, and you get the results that we've all talked about here. We had a specific site that we helped remediate, and that was in Sveti Shikotovo, just to the west of Pristina, near Glogovac, where 230 Kosovar Albanians had been massacred. And it was many weeks in high summer that bodies were being exhumed, scientists were gathering the evidence, and we were able, through that entire process, to be able to identify the remains and repatriate those bodies to their communities. But at the end of the day, what it reminds you of is that you can't take peace for granted. You should never be complacent, that just because we're educated, just because we're cultured, that we'll treat each other with dignity, that's not in fact been our experience. And the experience in Kosovo reinforced what we'd seen in Rwanda and in other places. As I think back onto the 25 years that have elapsed, that's what keeps coming back to me. That's the big lesson of Kosovo to me. And as Minister Axworthy so rightly pointed out, the international community got it right. We saw a just cause. We saw a reason to be there to protect civilians. And we left it better than we found it, to the great credit of the men and women of the Canadian Forces and the international community, our civilian police brothers and sisters who were there working side by side to make it a better place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Major General Mike Ward, for being here. I know you helped me bring all these veterans to this room and have been receiving way more emails from me on a daily basis than you would like. Before we end the part about the military, I want to recognize that in this room here with us tonight is Blerina Loche. She is a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. She is in her 20s, and she is the child of a Kosovar refugee who came to Nova Scotia. She's just one of the Kosovar refugees and children of the Kosovar refugees who serve in the Canadian Armed Forces and as law enforcement personnel, showing how Kosovar refugees and their families now contribute to peace and stability in Canada and around the world.
So we are going to take a 5-minute break. You can all actively stretch, and we are going to resume at 9 p.m. So 6 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Mirëmbrëma të nderuar mysafir, zonja dhe zotri. I hope you had a pleasant intermission and had a moment to connect and reflect on the experiences we've heard thus far. My name is Arta Tahira, and it is my honor to moderate the remaining half of the evening alongside Krenara. To commence the second half of our program, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Tringa Rejepe. Tringa arrived in Canada as a refugee in 1999 and is a talented artist in the music and arts space. Joined by her husband, Scott Christian, on piano, Tringa will perform a song in Albanian that speaks to our rich culture. Please join me in welcoming Tringa and Scott to the stage.
Faleminderit. Good evening. Hello, everybody. Before, I'm just going to go off script really quick. I am so deeply, deeply touched and honored to be looking out at this audience filled with people that have shaped the trajectory of the lives of all of the Albanian Kosovars in Canada. And on behalf of us all, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'd like to take a few minutes before I perform to share a bit about my story and how music and art were a lifeline for my family coming to Canada as part of Operation Parasol to Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1999. By a number of different measures, my family's story is a happy one. But like everyone who lived through the war and who made Canada their new adoptive home, it was also extremely hard. My mother, Bedria Rejepi, was an actor in Kosovo, and my father, Zechiria Rejepi, a renowned artist. We had it all back home. Life as we knew it, my parents, me, and my 5, yes, that's 6 kids, siblings, changed forever when our country came under siege. A terrifying journey began from our town across borders to a refugee camp in Macedonia, and then finally the flight to Halifax. But I actually want to focus on how arts and culture saved us once we got here, and how these lifelines helped us find our footing and prosper in Canada. We were extremely lucky to be paired with sponsor families in Halifax who, despite our language barrier, recognized my family's love of music and art. Canadians invited us into their homes, introduced us to the artistic community in Nova Scotia, and ultimately helped my father resume his work as a visual artist and helped me find my voice and passion for music and theater. I was 8 years old when we arrived, and one of our sponsors recognized my flair for the dramatic, can you tell? And they helped my parents enroll me in prominent theater training programs for young people in Halifax. Despite the fact that I spoke barely any English, I discovered a community where I belonged. My differences were celebrated. I also accelerated my English. Turns out Shakespeare is a heck of a boot camp. And I had my first moments of feeling safe, feeling comfortable, and like I could shine. The confidence I found through the arts helped shape a drive and passion for volunteering and giving back to the very community that took my family and I in, and thousands of other Kosovar Albanian refugees. I was able to use my voice to raise thousands of dollars for charities through countless benefit concerts and hundreds of hours of volunteering. This opened up a door for me to attend Sheridan College on a full scholarship and attend training in New York City on a full scholarship. As a newcomer and a refugee, that is not only an essential gift, but that is what lights a fire in young people to work harder and to give back to Canada. That first acting class for 8-year-old Tringa that my sponsor thought of for me has defined my entire life. I've had the privilege of working professionally across theaters in Canada, living out my dreams for the last decade. I'll also add that another great gift Canada gave me is my very Canadian husband, Scott Christian. Yes. And 4 months ago, we became parents to the cutest son imaginable, if I do say so myself, Albion Rejepi Christian. And now that I'm a parent, I have an even deeper appreciation for my parents' sacrifice and the generation behind me and the challenges they faced. And I'm seeing some of those faces in the audience that were in Halifax with me. And I just want to say thank you to our parents and to you all for working so hard to provide me and my younger Albanian friends the opportunities to thrive in this country. Thank you. Lastly, I just want to say that our experience as refugees and newcomers, of course, wasn't easy, but in so many ways, I hope you can hear from myself, and I'm sure the stories to follow, that the story is actually defined by care and support and safety, thanks to the systems and the programs and individuals once we got here. My family and many of the Albanians I'm sure you've met, we held on tightly to our culture and our past. But we have also written a new chapter here in Canada. To me, that is what being Canadian is all about and what I wish for every newcomer. Now I'd like to perform a song that all the Albanians in the room will know, dedicated to our beautiful homeland. This is Moje Bukur Arbëri by renowned Albanian artist Vace Zela.
Thank you so much, Tringa and Scott, for your remarks and that beautiful performance. Coming up next, please join me in welcoming Shqiponjat e Vogla, who will be performing a traditional Albanian dance, Volja e Preshkopjes. Thank you so much, Shqiponja e vogla. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to share a bit about my experience and perspective as a second-generation Kosovar Albanian born and raised in Canada. My family's story began when my father immigrated to Canada in the 1960s, making him one of the first Kosovar Albanians in the country. My mom would later join him in the 1980s, and together they worked to build a life here while also maintaining a strong connection to our culture. The impact of the Kosovo War in 1999 echoed within the diaspora. With our extended family in the thick of it, the broadcasts weren't just news stories. I remember watching my parents glued to the television, searching for any glimpses of loved ones amongst those being airlifted out of Kosovo. The sense of urgency and shared responsibility was felt deeply by the diaspora. Similar to many of you in the crowd this evening, my family lost loved ones and experienced the anguish of seeing our homeland torn apart. When the refugees arrived to Canada, not a single individual was a stranger to us. As Albanians, they were members of our family and members of our community. The diaspora rallied, including my parents, to welcome and support the newcomers as they began to rebuild their lives in Canada. Our next speaker will delve further into the experiences of the diaspora in 1999 and the vital role that they played. Please join me in welcoming Fisnik Prenice.
Today I'm a father, a husband, and a public servant. I live in Victoria, British Columbia, and I'm an assistant deputy minister with the BC government. But in 1999, I'd only been in Canada for a couple of years when the conflict started. And I would like to tell you how I experienced it from my vantage point of Vancouver, where I lived at the time. I was all the time very worried because my parents and my sister were back home. Always wondering what is going to happen to them. Very high level of anxiety. But what gave me some comfort was that we had communications. I was able to phone and talk to them all the time. And they went out of their way to tell me that everything was fine. There was no fighting in their region. Of course, the news was that people were being killed everywhere. And things got very much worse one day when they did not pick up the phone. And they just weren't there. So I phoned my uncle, who lived a couple of houses down, and he answered the phone in a very hushed voice. He sounded very terrified, this older man who I had known as nothing but just a brave person, but he was very, very scared, and he said that the soldiers had come to the street and they were emptying every house and sending people away, and I started asking some questions, and he just said, I can't talk right now, we have to go, and hung up. And so then it was a very, very difficult time. For many days I had no information. It was the most terrible time of my life. One day I got a call from an officer of Citizenship and Immigration Canada. They were calling from a refugee camp in Macedonia, telling me that they had found my parents, and that was just wonderful to hear that. It's kind of strange to be glad that you're hearing that your parents are in a refugee camp, but of course the alternative was much worse. I had thought that they were dead, so this was great news. Great news to find out that they had survived and they have left the country. Later, I found out that they were brought to the border and told, "This is not your country anymore. Get out of here." So they did not have a very good experience being in a refugee camp, but of course it was great news to hear that they had gone there. During this entire time, what I did was reading a lot of news. I read every newspaper, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and all the local newspapers in Vancouver. I watched all the news programs. The news were encouraging because it seemed like the world had had enough, and they would not let it go this time. The Western world, the democratic world, was ready to do something. We've been through Croatia and Bosnia a few years earlier. There's been a lot of talk, but no action. So of course, it was hard to believe that some action would be taken, but it did. And the resolve was there, and it persisted 78 days of war. So the Serbian war machine, Milosevic, was stopped finally. When my parents and my sister arrived in Vancouver, and my sister is here tonight, by the way, I should mention that, I found out that of all the effort that the Canadian government had made to support the refugees overseas, but as well as in Canada, I found out that one agency in Vancouver, Immigrant Services Society of British Columbia, was doing most of the work over there. So shout out to my old friend Chris, who's here with us as well, Chris Friesen from Immigrant Services Society. And I actually got a job and worked with them, so I got involved myself directly in helping my fellow Kosovars in settling in Canada. So Canada has done so much for Kosovars in 1999, both supporting the people, the country, diplomatically, militarily, and then also offering a home to so many people here. So everyone, you've heard so many times before that people, the thankfulness of people is so big. And so you hear from other Kosovo refugees tonight, but I thought it'd be good for you to just hear the perspective of someone who was here and how the Kosovo diaspora experienced this difficult time. Thank you.
Thank you to Fisnik Pernici for coming all the way from British Columbia to be here tonight. He welcomed me in British Columbia a few months ago, which there's an Albanian saying that goes, wherever you are, if you find an Albanian, you are at home. Our next speaker is Katrina Dragoshe. Katrina is a public servant with the government of Canada. Like me, Katrina came to Canada when she was just a child and is part of what migration scholars call the 1.5 generation. Those who came here as children and spend their lives balancing two identities. Please join me in welcoming Katrina Dragoshe.
My name is Katrina Dragoshe. I was born in Ferizaj, Kosovo, and I am a refugee. I left Kosovo during the war with my parents and my older brother. We spent 3 weeks in a refugee camp in Macedonia before landing in Greenwin, Nova Scotia in May of 1999. We were then transferred to Gagetown, New Brunswick, where we stayed for almost 2 months. I was 3 years old and my brother was 5. My brother has been blind since birth, and upon our arrival in Canada, my parents were still holding on hope that one day he would see. Volunteers with the Red Cross had told my father to stay close to Halifax, as this is where the IWK Children's Hospital was. Despite my father's efforts, we were told there were no spots left in Halifax, and the chosen destination for us was Saskatchewan. In the end, along with a few families we had met at Gagetown, we were all able to be resettled in Moncton, New Brunswick. It didn't take long before all the other families left Moncton, but because of my brother's situation, my parents chose to stay. I eventually moved to Halifax, but my parents and siblings never did leave, and they are still there today. Growing up in Moncton as a refugee was a challenge. It was a city that at the time was primarily white Canadians, and I'd love to say I embraced being Albanian, but for most of my life, I suppressed who I was. There was no other foreign students at school. And most of my elementary classmates didn't understand that other countries existed, or that war was a real thing and not just in movies. I would never speak Albanian in front of anyone. And I would never let my mom pack me Albanian food for lunch. And when Christmas came around, I would pretend to celebrate, so I didn't have to tell people I was Muslim. I never turned to my parents for advice, because they were dealing with the same thing in their lives. They too were immigrants. But unlike me, their accent gave them away. They couldn't hide who they were as easily as I could. The goal was to keep your head down and not give anyone a reason to have a problem with you. But I'm happy to say a lot has changed in 25 years. Kosovo is not the war-torn country it once was, and I am no longer afraid to show my culture. Visiting Kosovo is the highlight of my year, and this past summer, my childhood best friend, who is Canadian, joined me, and it was a heartwarming experience to finally see my two worlds unite. Although there was challenges, those of us who came to Canada young were lucky. We were lucky because we had fewer memories of the war. We were lucky that we learned English quickly and had an easier transition into Canadian culture. So I want to acknowledge those of you who came here as teenagers and young adults, those of you who grew up way before you were supposed to. You may have spent your final school years in Kosovo learning in private homes. Then you came to a new country, where many of you had to go straight into the workforce. You were often the translators for your families, and maybe you never had the opportunity to finish your studies. You had to make sacrifices, and I want to say thank you from my generation to yours, because you paved the way for the rest of us. Faleminderit duhet m'ju thonë edhe atyne që kanë orë Kanadë në moshën më të moshuar. Ju keni lind dhe jeni rrit në Kosovë, dhe ndoshta kur nuk e keni paramendu që vjen dita që do të me lon vendin tënë. Kur keni ardhur Kanadë, keni marrë vendimin për me nejtë këtu dhe m'ja nis një jetë të re. Keni qëndru Kanadë gjatë një kohës që nuk keni pas as muzikë shqip me dëgju, dhe rrjetet sociale nuk kanë ekzistu. Keni qëndru Kanadë për m'ja jap fëmijëve tu një jetë me mundësi dhe kushte më të mira. Ju na keni mësuar që me fol gjuhën shqipe dhe na sot halojmë bajmë kulturën dhe traditat shqiptare. Dhe në fund shpresoj që keni gjetë një rahati dhe një lumturi këtu në Kanadë, edhe pse kemi qelluar larg nga vendlindja. I always say Kosovo gave me life, but Canada gave me freedom. In Kosovo, I lived in a 3-room house with 12 of my family members. Financially, university would have never been an option for me, and my brother's disability would have left him without an education at all. Canada brought us opportunities that Kosovo could not give us, yet for an older generation, coming to Canada meant lost opportunities. Thank you to those who sacrificed their lives and careers back home so we could take advantage of this future Canada had to offer. Though many years have passed, we can't forget what we left behind. We can't forget those who lost family and friends during the war, or those who lost their lives fighting for Kosovo's freedom, or those who lost themselves because the terrors of war never leave you. I'm sad for those who didn't get out, for those who returned to destroyed homes, and for those who decades later still find themselves in an economic crisis. I encourage everyone to continue sharing our history with the younger generation. The pain and the resilience of our people must not be forgotten. Shpresoj që Kosova jonë vazhdon të zhvillohet si shtet dhe që ne në diasporë vazhdojmë ta mbajmë Kosovën në zemër. Faleminderit.
Thank you, Katerina Dragoshe, for being with us all the way from Halifax. Another person I met and reminded me that wherever there's an Albanian, I am at home. Next, we'll hear from Fazle Mazreku and his daughter, Flutra Mazreku Sibak. Fazle Mazreku is a distinguished Albanian academic and intellectual. In 1999, his life was in danger due to his work with international organizations. His daughter, Flutra Mazreku Sibak, was raised between Canada and Kosovo. She pursued higher education in Canada, earning a BA in Law and Philosophy from the University of Ottawa and an MA at Carleton University, specializing in international refugee law. Together, Fazle and Flutra will share the story of their reunion in Canada. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
I felt my mother's hand on my shoulder. Struggling to wake up from the deep sleep I was in, I opened my eyes to a room that was unfamiliar. It was the type of room I had only seen in movies, big and beautiful, that kind that only people on TV had. I was also sleeping on a bed, which was comfortable and spacious, unlike the pull-out couch I had shared with my siblings my entire life, and certainly very much unlike the tents and the floor I had slept on over the last few months. I noticed my brother, Drilon, was also sleeping beside me. Within seconds, I remembered that I was in my uncle's house and on my cousin's bed in Canada, a world away from my home. The moment Drilon and I opened our eyes, my mom enthusiastically, with a joy I had not seen on her face in a very long time, said, "Dad is alive. I just spoke to him on the phone." I had dreamt of hearing those words since the day we were separated from my father, and had all but resorted to the fact that I would never hear them. Trilon and I leaped into our mother's arms, tears rolling down our cheeks. But these tears were unlike the tears we had cried over the last 2 years. These were happy tears, terrified that I would be woken up at any moment and that this was all a beautiful dream. I continued to cling on to my mother until enough time had passed that I was assured that I was not dreaming. Dad really was alive. Good evening. My name is Frutra Mazreku-Sibak, and what you heard is just one part of my story, a story I'm writing about my survival of the war in Kosovo and my journey to Canada. My father, Fazli Mazreku, will now tell a part of his story in Albanian.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm told to speak in Albanian from the host, so I'll tell my story in Albanian. Ja, rosef që jem në këto është fakti se në vitin 1999, unë derisa kum punu me organizatën ndërkombëtare, kom qenë në listën e parë që me u likvidu në 3-4 ditëve prej datës 19 mars deri me fillimin e bombardimeve të NATO-s. Dhe fati jam është që unë ato ditë jam largu nga Rahoveci, mendimin e misionit verifikues të OSB-s në Kosovë dhe jam shku në zonën e Malishevës, aty ku kanë qenë disa zonat ngushta që cilat kanë qenë të OQK-s. Dhe me tha, aty nuk ka mund me deportu ushtria dhe policia serbe. Dhe prej asaj date, deri me 16 qershor, kur ka hy NATO dhe unë kom shku në Shqipëri, nuk kom ditë për familjen tembe se a janë gjallë apo kanë vdek. Asnjë informacion nuk kom pas. Dhe keqja më e madhe është se ato ditë është vrarë një person me emrin e njëjtë dhe me emrin e Fazli Mazreku nga Deçani, për cilin njerëzit kanë menduar se jam unë. Edhe këtë farefisje ime dhe familja ime kanë menduar se unë jam i vdekur. Në fakt unë kam qenë gjallë sepse kam qenë në zonat e UQK-s ku kanë qenë të dominuara me prej tyre. Dhe në momentin kur kam shku me 16 kur ka hyrë NATO, ne kam shku në Tiranë me i ly familjen sepse në qytet nuk kanë qenë. Dhe atje kom morë vesh se vetëm 3-4 orë para se me më rrinë Tiranë të kanë ikë për Kanadë. Duke mos që ditu se unë jam gjallë. Duke falenderu misionit e OSB-s që është shpërngull nga Kosova në Tiranë, atëherë unë marrë 10 dite pas një dokumentacion, ju më përgatitë dhe kom shku edhe i kom gjetë familjen. Dhe tha, kjo është ai fati, po fati jonë është fati i mira e familjeve shqiptare që kanë kalu kalvarin e tyre duke shkuar në Maqedoni dhe në Shqipëri. Në Maqedoni me 1 metër katror kanë jetu 10 njerëz. Me një kamp i cili s'ka pas është qenë mjaftueshëm, smundje, trishtim, po fati i madh është që qeveria kanadeze me programin parasol ta bënte mëshme transportimin e 6.000 shqiptarëve nga kampi i Stankovicit të Maqedonisë në Kosovë. Unë mendoj se merita më e madhe pse ne jemi sot këtu është sepse fal qeverisht kanadeze, cila ka qenë për qeverie më eficiente në botë, që kanë ndihmuar popullin shqiptar që të vijë dhe të sërohet në Kanada. Bile unë kam një ide nuk di sa është e realizueshme, që komuniteti shqiptar në Kanada me këshyr mundësit e rregulla sepse qeveria kanadeze meriton me marrë çmimin Nobel për paqen në mënyrë retroaktive, a posteriori, sepse atë që ka bërë kjo qeveri për neve, askush në botë nuk ka mund ta bëjë. Prandaj lus komunitetin në bashkëpunim me ambasadën tonë dhe Ministrinë e Punëve të Jashtme të Kosovës me këshyr anë ligjore, a ka mundësi që a posteriori një qeveri që meriton të merë çmimin Nobel për paqe, sepse ka shpëtuar 6.000 familje. Është njëri prej misioneve më të mëdha humanitare në botë që ka bën një qeveri brenda 2 muajve. Kështu që kjo është një histori e cila ju përket gjithëve, është dhimbje mirë, po sot ne jemi fatbarë që jemi integruar në shoqërinë kanadeze në aspektin kulturor, në aspektin e punës, në aspektin e shkollimit dhe jemi pjesë integrale në një shoqëri moderne e cila na ka pranuar me gjithë zemrën, na ka dhënë mundësitë dhe oportunitete që vërtet ne jemi të pjesë e barabartë e kësaj shoqërie.
Our story is a story of suffering, but also a story of triumph. My family and I will forever be grateful to Canada, but we can never forget where we come from. For me, the love of my two countries, Kosovo and Canada, and my past, present, and future are perfectly combined in my soon-to-be-born son, whose middle name will be in Albanian, so that he never forgets his roots. Thank you very much. Faleminderit.
Thank you so much, Faleminderit shumë Flutran Fazli, for sharing your impactful story. Your words offer a profound reminder of both the resilience and courage required in the refugee experience. Our next speaker will offer insights from his lived experience, sharing what it means to be a refugee and how his journey has shaped his life and work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Agron Alia.
Good evening, everyone. Are we having fun? Yay! Dear guests, honorable guests, first of all, let me just say a big thank you to members of Parliament, members of Canadian government, His Excellency with Diplomatic Corps, Mr. Adriatic Criaziu, and everybody else who found time today or tonight to come here and share this wonderful, wonderful evening. I also would like to extend my true gratitude and appreciation to Krenare and everybody else in this committee who made this happen. In today's world where it's dominated by conspiracy theories, by wars, by all political turmoils and economic instability, to find a people and to find a time to get together to have this kind of conversation, it's just amazing. Thank you, ladies. Thank you to everybody. Appreciate it. So just a brief introduction about myself. Obviously, I'm Dr. Agron Alia. I was born in Kosovo, and I'm living in Canada now. I'm a family physician in London. I'm also an emergency physician in Newbury, and I'm associate professor at the Schulich Medicine. And I'm also a proud recipient of the formal recognition from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1999 for my participation in many times named Operation Parasol. Speaking of that operation, I see here many distinguished Canadian military personnel, and I just want to say thank you guys. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you find the way or strength or what is the motivation to go from one part of the world, basically Canada, end up in a country that you've never been, you don't know, and you're ready to sacrifice everything. So there has to be something special for you, and really, really thank you, because believe it or not, you are a good part of the reason why we are talking today about Kosovo 25 years later. Lots of things have been said, and beautiful things, obviously. I just wanted to touch on one subject, and that is being the war refugee. If you look at it by definition, it's really very simple. So who is a war refugee? What does it mean being a war refugee? Well, the war happens in your country or in some country, and the people escape, the lucky ones end up in a different country that is not at war. That's very simplistic approach to the war refugee. While I was living in Kosovo, I thought that I actually had a pretty good grasp of that, but the reality kicked in very soon, because once you become a war refugee, you lose a sense of belonging. You lose the sense of pride. You lose everything, and it's not about just losing your car, your home, but as a being, as somebody that grows in you, gets destroyed slowly but securely until you find yourself back in your feet in whatever country you ended up. Well, in our case, lots of Albanians ended up in Canada, and we were welcomed open hands. We were actually taken in Canadian homes as good as it gets in the best possible way. And that is something that we will never forget, even with the generations to come. Because even my daughter now, she is an adult, she is 29 years old, she still talks about it, how we, my wife and myself, talk about Canadians the way they accepted us in Canada when we came in 1999. If you can just imagine for the moment, and I'll give you a true sense of what happens once you become a war refugee. It is, I'm going to give you my personal experience. So I was working as a physician in a clinical center at University of Pristina. Besa, my wife, she was working as a teacher. We had 2 children. And at that time, plans were very simple and hopes were simple, so we were hoping to move into a larger apartment and get a new car. Believe it or not, all of that changed within 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, we found ourselves in Hamilton, Ontario, with 2 plastic bags of belongings, 2 children, and not even knowing what tomorrow is going to bring. It took nearly 5 years for us to finally say, this is the place now that we are going to start to build the dreams that were shattered by the war and by the fact that all of a sudden you are a war refugee. As you could notice tonight, so many people are still talking about themselves as a war refugee, despite the fact that we are all now Canadian citizens. But the fact that we came the way that we came during that war, during that turmoil, something engraved in our hearts and in our brain that we are still those war refugees that we are today, and we are surviving today, and we are doing today. We are trying to pay back with our contributions to Canadian society and become true Canadian citizens in every possible way. And that happened really and truly thanks to Canadians who were here, who were in a fantastic way organized through the settlements, through other organizations, NGOs that we mentioned earlier, to make our transition much smoother. I'm not going to extend it. This night has been long already, but I just wanted to actually digress a little bit and tell you a 30-second story, what happened today, why tonight is so special for me and for my wife, Besa. 25 years ago, James Hill, he was a career diplomat in Kosovo who worked even before the war started. He was basically the person that laid the groundworks for everything, and we had a great, great pleasure and privilege to work with him before the war and during the war when it started. He came and personally said goodbye to us in airport in Skopje, in Macedonia. Since then, we were in contact here and there, but I didn't see James. Well, tonight James came here and recognized me, and we talked and we tried to catch up within 5 minutes. James, please, can you stand up so everybody can give you a big round of applause? So together with James, we worked in the Kosovo diplomatic mission that later converted into Organization for Security of Cooperation of Europe that in a way tried to establish peace in Kosovo and ultimately failed. And then we got the Canadian military coming in and bringing the peace and freedom to Kosovo. So thank you guys, thank you again. It's a great, great pleasure to be here. Everybody, have a good.
Thank you, Dr. Alia, for being here with us tonight. And usually, as the moderator, I do not like digressions, but one of my motivations for tonight was to reunite people who were involved 25 years ago, and so that really makes me feel like tonight was worth all the effort it took this year, which was a lot. The next speaker is a lifelong human rights advocate. He currently works for the Government of Canada and is the former director of the Office of Immigration and Multiculturalism in Newfoundland and Labrador, and chair of the Newfoundland and Labrador Human Rights Commission, as well as a featured speaker for Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Speak Truth to Power project on awareness and education. He will speak on the experiences of Kosovar refugees and the broader human rights lessons that is learned from it. Please join me in welcoming Remzi Tse.
As you can imagine, this is an emotional topic for all of us, so I've taken some notes, and I'll be reading from my notes just to keep me on track, because I'm sure most of you are keen to leave the room soon. I'm standing between you and the book signing. Thank you very much, Krenare and Organizing Committee, for the invitation to join you. I do want to start with an acknowledgement that I'm joining you this evening in Toronto, but I'm originally, I'm currently living in the traditional and historic lands of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq in Nitaquamook, which is currently known as Newfoundland and Labrador. It is a pleasure to be here this evening for many reasons, for very personal reasons that many of you have outlined already. But it's especially meaningful for Kosovars from the East Coast who call Toronto the place with a Kosovar deli and grocery store. We love to go to North York and get our Kosovar sujuk supplies before we head off to see Kylie Minogue, and as it happens, Taylor Swift. That's my plan for this weekend, and then the plan for spring is Kylie, so hopefully see you in a few months' time again. There's something about empathy that connects people from seemingly radically different backgrounds to fellow humans in need wherever they may be. It's that universal ability to transcend differences in favor of the common humanity we share. By mid-April 1999, my parents, my uncle, and I found ourselves forced out of our home and our community by the Serbian paramilitary, walking aimlessly along with tens of thousands of other Kosovars systematically expelled from our communities because of our ethnic identity. We were the lucky ones. 20 members of my extended family were murdered while they were seeking shelter, while they were farming, while they were walking, while they were traveling on a bus. My older brother was missing from the war for nearly 6 years, and the tendency to want to hate would have been very easy. And yet something happened during this time of desperation that kept reminding us that there were decent people working hard to end the attacks on Kosovars. Late at night, in the dark and cold basement of our home, we listened to Radio Free Europe on a radio powered by a car battery and marveled at the fact that the world cared about what we were going through. In that very dark, very cold basement, hiding from Serbian military attacks, we felt like the world was determined to act to protect us. People around the world marched for an end to violence against Kosovars, and the Kosovar experience taught us that sometimes intervention is needed to stop human rights abuses, as Dr. Axworthy made a strong case for this evening, and reminding us of our responsibilities to protect vulnerable civilians when their governments can't, won't, or are actively working to persecute and target them. It may have seemed counterintuitive to some that military action can bring about civilian protection, But when we heard the NATO planes flying above the sky or leaflets falling from above telling Serbian troops that they were fighting an unjust war, we knew we were not forgotten. I'm here today thanks to that action that you and your colleagues did, Canadian Armed Forces friends who are here, and we were very honored that we were able to thank you for that service. On day 4 of our 9-day walk, we walked into a scene of a Serbian woman who, on the side of the road, was wiping her tears while she was filling up water bottles for dozens of thirsty people. The pain was visible on her face, and though many of us were angry, this gesture diffused a lot of it. The mental image of this woman has remained with me, and over the years has represented an example of the power of individual action. One person couldn't stop the war, but they could make a difference in the lives of others affected by it. Our arrival in Canada has given me a chance to build on this idea of the power of individual action through engagement at community and national level. And very quickly after arrival, I became aware of how common my experience of ethnic cleansing was around the world. It was overwhelming to think about the fact that at any given time, there were 200 internal, civil, and international wars and conflicts as I walked peacefully to and from my school in St. John's. But it was also a call to action because I couldn't take for granted this privilege of living in peace. I spoke at parliamentary committees, I organized public demonstrations, held community talks and petitions, urging the Canadian government to use its voice to do the right thing. Whether it was in Darfur, in Myanmar, in Guantanamo Bay, or in Canada itself, when same-sex marriage became a national issue for Canadians and a very personal issue for me. Most importantly, becoming Canadian imbued a sense of responsibility to act in the face of injustice. With the adoption of citizenship, we had the responsibility to learn about the horrific past of Indigenous settler relations and to commit to do better. Each and every one of us has the ability to do this, and I know fellow Kosovar Canadians are making that difference across this country. The display boards that you've been seeing this evening further confirm this. My Kosovar family has remained in Newfoundland and Labrador for all these years because some very kind souls, and I'll name them this evening, Father Andrew Hall and the Titford family, who knew very little about Kosovo and much less about my family, stepped up to help as sponsors when they saw gruesome war scenes on their TV screens. Their humanity, their kindness, and generosity of spirit have turned us into lifelong Newfoundlanders and Labradorians by choice, and proud Kosovar Canadians who continue to pay it forward in all the ways we can. This evening, thank you, Canada, for changing our lives and making it possible for us to make a difference in someone else's. Faleminderit.
I really thought I was going to get through tonight without crying, and I did not. So thank you, Ramzitse, for your reflections.
The next song, Mora Fjall, is a deeply powerful piece that resonates with many Kosovar Albanians. It serves as a poignant reminder of the lasting scars of war. For me personally, when I listen to this song, I think of my cousin and his friend. In 1999, they were held at gunpoint in their home in Mitrovica, and they faced a harrowing choice. They were asked to choose between their lives and the safety of their families. They chose to save their families, and at only 26 years old, my cousin and his friend were kidnapped and never seen alive again. They remained missing for 22 years until both of their remains were discovered in a mass grave in 2021, reopening wounds that have never healed and perhaps never truly will.
Arta and I have chosen to close the program with this song as a reminder that although we celebrate the triumphs and successes of Kosovar refugees, we also remember the more than 12,000 Kosovar refugees that remain missing. To conclude the program and to reflect on the experiences heard this evening, Mora Fjall will be sung operatic by Ledor Batbatinka, who himself arrived as a refugee in 1999. Please join us in giving Ledor a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. I just have a few words. I just want to say personally thank you to everybody who attended here. Thank you to all the political officials. Thank you to all the military personnel, the police officers, forces, and all of you who have made it here today and those who were unable to make it. The reality is that a lot of us have faced struggle, and struggle is not what has defined us. Rather, it is the victory and the triumph that has led us to this moment here. I am proud to say that I've come to Canada, and I am now serving as the emergency department manager of the #1 functioning and performing emergency department in the province of Ontario. And mark my words, it will become #1 in Canada soon. With that said, I do want to end this by just singing this song. It's the first time that I'm singing an actual song in Albanian, a full song. I've sang in Italian, I've sang in English, but Albanian tonight's the first time. So please disregard any mispronunciations, all you true Albanians out there. And while my speaking voice is soft, my singing voice is loud, so just take that into consideration when you put on the song, please.
Mora fjall, mora vargun, mora charkun, me thurkan bash legendary tikendoi adam yashari tikendoi Tar Soviet se sheprekacin dhe rechakun Tar Soviet se shedrenicen Tar Soviet dhe Mitrovicen Tar Soviet Qo po thojnë zoqtë malit dhe bilbila qo adem Po thojnë lullet rëndafila qo adem Po thojnë kanget thojnë dhe trima qo adem Qo shpejt masrit të varit thot nan lokja qo se mjaf Ta fladiti balin toka qo se ty Të kërkon e tan Kosova ty adem Mora fjall, mora vargun, mora charkun me thurkan bash legendary tikendoi adem yashari tikendoi Heti them se gjakoj ti esht vet liria që kath Në Kosovë priqiv drinit kjo liri Ja fladit e balin trimit Ja fladit
We weren't sure who was going to go first to speak and say a few words of closing. I know that this has been an incredible evening. Some of us have tears out on the outside, some of us have tears on the inside. There we go. So I just want to say a quick word of thanks. And there is delicious desserts and drink and book signing on the other side of those doors. So I'll just take a couple of moments. Many people have mentioned Crenara's hard work and vision tonight, and I just want to take this moment. You didn't know I was going to do this, so surprise. But take a moment to thank you for all of your efforts, the incredible team of friends and family and community that you've brought together. Thank you. I'm looking for Crenara's family in particular to say big thank you. Bravo. And I know you, Crenara, will speak to this, but one of the visions for this evening and the event tomorrow at the University of Toronto really was to foster conversations. We talk a lot about histories of migration and community in this country, and very rarely do we get to hear multiple perspectives and create new memories. And this evening and tomorrow, we're all about that. So thank you for your efforts. Thank you to all of you for being here. I hope that you will continue these conversations, and there will be many more memories created and future stories to be told. So thank you.
There's not much left for me to say tonight, other than that I appreciate that you're all here. This is part of an ongoing effort to write the experiences of Kosovars and the experiences of Kosovo War into the national narrative. Carleton University will be launching a special archive dedicated to the experience of Kosovar refugees and those who supported them. I appreciate the work of the committee, my friends Rebecca and Emma, who did a lot of the behind the scenes and support. They're sitting over here. My parents, who even though it would have been easier to forget our past, have made sure that I never will. And Arta, who has been my partner in all things Albanian. And with that, we are closing the program. As we said, there are more drinks. The bar is open, and there are desserts on the other side of that stage. And thank you for being with us. Oh, and Lloyd Axworthy is signing his book